But I want to talk to you tonight. I want to start off with something really encouraging. While Labor might be struggling to take the right lessons from the election outcome, one person at least has read it right. And that happens to be the most important person, the winner of the election, Scott Morrison. 3 nights ago, he delivered the strongest speech we've heard from a Prime Minister in many a year. He was clear, he was strong, and he was focused on this nation's pride, resilience, history, potential, and most importantly, its sovereignty. I was at the event, the Lowy Lecture, and I'd just filed my Australian column warning about the insidious onslaught of globalism across the world, how things like the UN's Sustainable Development Goals and corporate social responsibility plans that big business are imposing on us, and all sorts of action on climate, energy and gender undertaken under these plans, other social issues as well, all without asking you or I, all without asking voters or shareholders for endorsement. So having written about this, I was delighted when the Prime Minister got up at this Lowy Lecture and attacked negative globalism head on. He said Australia would start pushing back against this stuff through the UN and other multilateral bodies that we're involved in. As I've been arguing for many years on issues such as Brexit in the UK, the rise of Donald Trump in the US, and of course border protection and climate policy here in Australia, the real contest in politics these days is largely between globalism and sovereignty. While Morrison's actions have given us lots of cause for hope in the past, in this speech he articulated for the first time in a consolidated way how he's driven to ensure sovereignty trumps globalism from here on in.
We will continue to bring clear objectives and enduring values to our international engagement. Freedom of thought, expression, spirit, faith, our humanity, inalienable human rights, freedom of exchange, free and open markets, free flow of capital and ideas, freedom from oppression, coercion, freedom of choice. We don't talk about these things enough, probably with our kids, you know. And they are under threat. Not just from the direct challenge of competing worldviews that are profit around the place, but frankly the complacency of Western liberal democratic societies who've forgotten too often that they owe their liberty and prosperity to these values. Australia does and must always seek to have a responsible and participative international agency in addressing global issues based on these values. But it has to be a positive and practical globalism. Our interests are not served by isolationism and protectionism, but it also does not serve our national interests when international institutions demand conformity rather than independent cooperation on global issues. The world works best, we believe, I believe, when the character and distinctiveness of independent nations is preserved with a framework of mutual respect. And this importantly includes respecting the electoral mandates of their constituencies.
Yeah, he says your vote, our democratic will, is more important than UN agreements and global campaigns. This was music to our ears, and it shows how Morrison is listening to voters and watching the currents of international politics. Those many leftist critics who say Morrison doesn't have an agenda ought to read this speech very closely indeed. There's plenty to do. Much of the media coverage of the speech, as usual, has been superficial and focused on the criticisms rather than the substance. Do yourself a favour. Go and read the full thing on the PM's website, but I'll show you some more of it tonight, don't you worry about that, including this next bit where Morrison tackles one of those issues where the globalists are concentrating their strongest efforts, climate change, of course. This country and much of the Western world is confronted with never-ending alarmism, exaggeration, catastrophism and doom and gloom over climate, when the truth is it's another issue for us to examine closely, consider and respond to. Here's Scott Morrison on the ridiculous moral panic some people seem keen to encourage.
This is not the first time our children have grown up in a time of global tension and disruption. This is a context and perspective I fear is too often missing in our contemporary discussion of global issues and threats. My generation grew up under the threat of nuclear Armageddon, hoping, as Sting put it, that the Russians loved their children too. My parents' generation grew up during the greatest global conflict in world history, including the Holocaust. The invasion of what was then Australian soil in New Guinea, the bombing of Darwin, and Japanese sub in Sydney Harbour sinking ferries. My grandparents grew up during the war to end all wars, where every neighbourhood knew the cost as 60,000 Australians were killed in action and missing out of a population of not even 5 million at the time, and who then went on to endure the Great Depression before backing up to fight to defend our freedom, most particularly in my grandfather's case, in the Middle East and the Pacific. Now, those generations recognised these as existential challenges of their time, and they were, but they responded with a practical resilience, an optimism, a resolve, rather than the anxiety-inducing moral panic and a sense of crisis that we sometimes frankly see too often in some circles today.
Yeah, stop panicking, start thinking, start considering, start examining and start acting. Very good advice there from Scott Morrison. It was a terrific speech. It gives us great hope for the direction of this government. The Coalition's critics, Labor, the Greens, the ABC, Twitter and the like, well, all they could come up with was the unoriginal line that Morrison was starting to sound like Trump. And I think they meant that as an insult.